Continuing chapter 2 of part 5. No such admonition had ever before been made. It embodied a messianic idea, loftier and broader than any other Jewish mind and heart had held. Because, of course, Christianity would have been at least 8 ways against Tanakh, let alone what the rabbis came up with. They believed that the Messiah, the Christ, should be one of the sons of men, like any other great man, and should be chosen and anointed by reason of the greatness and splendors of his virtues to be the deliverer of his people. But Peter acknowledged his Messiah as directly begotten of God. In his solemn praise, he did not use the word living to distinguish God, the true God, from dead idols, but to intensify the idea that was in the word son. Although you could say he kind of did, because it wasn't like it was a only Jew state and people of other faiths were allowed throughout. But it was particular, like, say we all be Lucifers, light bringers, but only the Lucifer around or at the time or whatever. It was not the question who God was, but the question who Jesus was that Peter was answering. So obviously different than God, because at the very least you can say that. Jesus accepted the homage. Let us remind ourselves that we are making historical studies and not dogmatic theological assertions. Well, if you're repeating what is, oh yeah, people said it, but how is it historical for somebody to be a deity or son of a deity or whatever? Whether it's true or whatever the case is, is a theological assertion based on how someone else made the theological assertion. So it's a belief, right? The question now is not whether Jesus was right or wrong, but what he thought and said and did. It is most obvious that at this period of his career, he believed himself to be the Son of God in a sense separate and distinct from any other with which the phrase could be applied to other men. He was the Messiah, the Christ, the sent, the anointed. Well, Mashiach and Mashiach, same thing. Christos, again, covered as in Masih, being covered with oil, secondary figure sent by somebody. It's basically all saying the same thing. And denying that Jesus was the only person ever that ever honestly fulfilled that for God, right? His people were looking for a temporal deliverer. He was the only deliverer they should have, and he was a spiritual deliverer. With such sentiments, he made his solemn reply to Peter. Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Remember, there's no J sound. Bar-Yuna. Shmaun Bar-Yuna. For flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father in the heavens. And I also say unto thee, thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my congregation, and the gates of death, Hades, shall not prevail against it. I will give thee the keys of the kingdom of the heavens, and what thou shalt bind upon earth shall be bound in the heavens, and what thou shalt loose on the earth shall be loosed in the heavens. Now, a lot of Protestant and Catholic debate has been on where to put the comma in the translation. And then it's actually not as simple as that, because some say, well, it's, if you, they do side with the Catholics in the interpretation, but they're like, well, it didn't descend through your line. It was broken before that. Like the church I was raised in, the LDS, they were, they were definitely with the early Christian church, but they weren't, but they didn't think that what happened after was necessarily part of the same line. Jesus had been, in some measures, and by certain terms, acknowledged as Messiah in early parts of his history, but no confession had yet recognized him as at once divine and human. Such he held himself to be. Now, where does Jesus actually ever say that? And moreover, he held that that view of his nature could not be reached by any process of human reasoning or any leap of human imagination. It was a direct revelation from heaven. The literal words of Jesus are, "Flesh and blood have not apocalypsed it to thee, but my Father. From such a mystery no human hand could have raised the veil and made the apocalypse, no hand but God's. It is manifest that Jesus believed his own character and person such a miracle that no intellectual analysis of his words and acts could enable any man to reach the apprehension of them. He was a blessed man to whom the eternal Father vouchsafed such a revelation. It must have been the deepest conviction that drew such utterances from Jesus. He was joyous in his solemnity. He calls Simon by his other name, Cephas, Peter, rock. Cathal was probably the word he used, speaking in the Aramaic tongue, and this word, Grecized, was Cephas, and translated into Greek was Petros, of which our English is rock. He ascends from Bar-Jonah to Peter. The whole speech of Jesus to Peter, which must be acknowledged as one of the most important, if not the most important of all his sayings, has been a source of great perplexity. The trouble with many commentators is their hardened ecclesiasticism. When churchism hangs like a veil over the faces of men, they do not see the face of Jesus. They hear his words as men hear the mumbling of a priest through the baize curtain at the church door. A succeeding commentator may be afraid to differ from his predecessors, lest he be charged with heresy, or at least irregularity. Well, if you're thinking for yourself, you're thinking for yourself, or if you're not just merely going along, you're not just merely going along. It's the same thing, really. And nowadays, a safety of not being able to see the congregation or the preacher from the outside is actually probably a good idea, because people are seeking out places where people aren't armed, in particular. Many of the Protestant writers are as papal as the Roman writers. Roman Catholicism is the concentration of papacy on one pope. Sectarian Protestantism is the division of the papacy among many popes. Many men seem afraid to know what Jesus really meant. They hear him through the ear trumpet of the church. They see him through the stained glass of the church. To reconcile these sayings of Jesus with the truth and the known facts of history will be a perpetual tax on the ingenuity of those who at the same time hold to churchism. If a man can only dare to look at the truth full in the face and accept the truth and its logical connections, he will have less difficulty with the questions of the rock and the keys. Let us venture to utter the truth even at the peril of being cast out of the synagogue. Jesus never intended to establish a church in the modern sense of the term, namely a close corporation inside which should be all that are to be saved, while all outside should be damned. He never intended to institute any body in which should exist the distinction of clergy and laity, which should, as a whole, dictate to its members and to the world what their faith should be. Well, certainly, a nation of priests and priestesses is what actually Zarathustra, Jesus. It's harder to make the point saying Moses, but there's perhaps indication of that. But the outside, see the outside of certain beliefs and practices, certainly that was, given the gravity it would. He abrogated priesthood as a corporation, making every man a priest and every woman a priest. But, the churches now on earth are mere human economical arrangements with no spiritual authority to declare that any man is a saint or a sinner. Well, see, what fits in with the teachings, see, that's where the authority comes from. Because people say that. It's like, well, you don't have authority to say in the inner. And, okay, fine. As communities and associations for propagating the principles of Jesus, they may be useful. As hierarchies, they are hurtful. They may turn a man out of their body, but that in no way affects his relations to Jesus or to God. Jesus was full of anti-churchism. Well, Matthew 7:21-23. Don't do things in his name. It's not about the title of him. So definitely turning away from that hero worship stuff. And there's other passages we can turn to, because the church is the hero shrine. But he seemed to have a mission to destroy churchism, which was so encrusting human hearts that they could not grow into beauty and ripen into maturity in the sunlight of God's love and smile. He was a secular, a dissenter, a come-outer, an independent, anything you please to call him, but churchman, if he were living in our midst. Now he would endure to be called glutton, winebibber, friend of publicans and sinners, and make no more resentment than he did when he was on earth, but he would not allow himself for a moment to be shrunk into the contemptible insignificance of a mere churchman. Living or dying to multitudes, to his disciples in parable or plain speech, he never used the word church so far as the records show. Ecclesia is a different term entirely. And even in the Pauline stuff, we're going to twice in Matthew, and it never occurs in the other three evangelists. A word in the original is translated church. The other passage is in Matthew 18:17, and it will be considered in its place. If it were granted, which it is not, that the word means what is now ordinarily understood by church, it would be a most remarkable thing that this teacher, who was a great talker in every sense, should have only twice alluded to the subject of church. But when we come to examine these two passages, we find no church in them. One of them is this, which records the confession of Peter, "On this rock I will build my church," are the words of the common English version. The Greek word translated church is ekklesia, which doesn't mean an organization of any kind, but simply a congregation. And it actually means more than a congregation in a way, because it's not just your close family. So the restrictions in the Pauline section against women in the ecclesia is actually broader than the place of worship or the congregation. It's when non-close family are present. Now, does that mean even cousins? If the cousins are present, then they can't talk or whatever. But a difference of opinion in that, if you're going to be honest. But certainly the non-family. An assembly brought together by the common crier in Athens was called the ecclesia. In all the English versions before the days of Queen Elizabeth, except Wycliffe's, the word was translated congregation. The word church was substituted in the Bishop's Bible for the word congregation. And I don't know if it's going to mention this, but the word Easter first appears in the King James Version Bible, and by express order of King James was so substituted in the Authorized Version of 1611 in every place where it occurs in the New Testament. Now, there's a lot of talk about the faithful to the 1611, but there was actually 100 ones to follow. I don't remember the exact number, but it's over 100 King James versions of the Bible. But, there's been some changes, even verses added and subtracted. So that's to be considered. How is it? the paraphrase version, sure, but it's not the King James version of the Bible anymore. When they've and didn't it have the Apocrypha? Wasn't the Apocrypha part of the 1611? There were even, anyways, there were different numbers of books other than 66 as times went on. In the German versions, the Roman Catholic translators and commentators employed the term Kirche, church, while the Protestants use Gemeinde, congregation. The German Bible, published in 1557 by Conrad Badius, as congregation. As Jesus performed no ecclesiastical act, as he made no organization of any kind, as he gave no directions to his disciples to make any kind of close corporation, as he nowhere speaks anything which involves the idea of churchness in any measure or sense, and as he broke in with many ruptures upon the ecclesiasticism which existed among his own countrymen, teaching that character was everything and mere position was incidental, we have a right to believe that he was no churchman. Again, it wasn't about, oh, I'm the hero, and it was about my personality. It was about that message and that closeness to God and whatnot. But it was apparent that he would have appointed people to have authority to go teach and that sort of stuff, but again, it's whoever was to join in whatever was considered good or true, that became the thing. What then did he mean? Simply this: his congregation, that is, all who heard his call and came to it, should be built upon the foundation of the hearty belief that he was a divine personage, the Son of the living God, and sent and set apart to be the deliverer. Whether he had any right to make such a claim is a question for the Department of Theology. All that we concern ourselves to know is this: what did he mean? He certainly meant that much, and that is more than churchism. Did I say the note that the other passage is? Oh, yeah, I did. He meant that whoever took Jesus for his deliverer, that soul was of his congregation, whether baptized or not, whether enrolled in any society or church or not. All other things had fluctuations, but this belief in him was to be the one invariable element of life. It was to be the firmest foundation on which character could be built. He evidently believed also and taught that in all ages there would be men who, like Peter, would plant and stake their all upon a hearty belief in Jesus as the divine deliverer of human souls, so that whether there should be visible churches or not, this congregation should exist forever. The gates of the grave, the underworld, death, for this word translated hell in the common version means this, and not a place of punishment. The gates of death shall not prevail against it, which simply mean that men may be born and may die, but there would always be those who believed in him as divine and trusted in him as their Savior, and these should constitute his congregation. Well, okay, we can look at Savior in these Zoroastrian senses. Like, what is a human incarnate Savior? Somebody, they come with a message and they live out the message, and that gives people opportunity. It presents an example. It's Shayashant was never an idea of an incarnate deity. Quite naturally, can the words which follow be interpreted if one's mind be turned away from the fixed idea of churchism? All the controversy on the meaning of the powers of the keys has arisen from supposing that Jesus was talking church, to which subject he was making no allusion in any way whatever. The kingdom of the heavens does not mean a church or the church. The very breadth of the expression ought to have led men to see that it means something much larger. The kingdom of the heavens can no more be contained in the church than the whole physical heavens can be folded up and laid away in a stone cathedral. He that is only a churchman shall have only the keys of the church. Whatsoever he binds shall be bound in the church. Whatsoever he looses shall be loosened in the church. But that is his limit. He cannot go outside this human organization called his the church. But whosoever receives Jesus as divine and trusts him as the Savior shall have the keys of all heavens, the range of the universe, and all home rights in the Father's house of many mansions. How much grander and more reasonable is this teaching of Jesus than the dogmas of some scholastic theologians? Well, I make a lot of scholastic commentary, and what I'm trying to get at is what the actual teaching was, the different translations. A lot of things I don't have issue with the actual text. And I certainly don't have issue with the original text with a lot of these things. But if you have a different opinion or a different conclusion, whatever. But yeah, I don't want to hold myself in any way as above the prophets and that sort of thing. So the actual teaching is the primacy. So basically this guy is saying fundamentalism here, but kind of differs in spots. Take any of their theories and how little and immaterial they are. They narrow heaven and belittle God and degrade Jesus. Well, people say what they know about or what they think they know about or whatever, and it's not necessarily an insult to God or the prophets or anything, but they pledge the infinite one to sanction any decisions of a very frail man whom Jesus, in almost the next breath after this commendation, was compelled to rebuke and call Satan, or else they yield into the hands of a corporate body of men compromising wise and foolish, learned and ignorant, strong and weak, good and wicked, the monopoly of deciding all moral questions and all human destinies. Now, whether the group's better or worse, people so often say, oh, I had a problem with this one guy, so I'm leaving religion. It's like, no, that's not on any particular religion for people to be like that. If that is what Jesus meant in this interview, he therein contradicted all that he had taught elsewhere, which was that character is everything and office nothing as concerns a man's personal salvation. It drops him immeasurably. If that was his meaning, he is no more than a priest and a Levite. He ceases to be of the cosmopolitan soul and multitudinous man, the loftiest son of man and the only begotten Son of God. Now, what Anton Caesar LaVey was, LaVey, was he actually from a Jewish family, or was that changed for a stage name? Because there was some changing with his name, but I don't remember that. If there be any consistency in his doctrines, Jesus intended to apply to all men who made Peter's confession this proposition which he uttered concerning Peter. It would be most uncritical to take this solitary passage and interpret it into a signification which contradicts all his other teachings, to say that the power of the keys signifies the prerogative of the apostles either to admit into the kingdom of heaven or to exclude from it, is to say that Almighty God abdicated in favor of an impetuous though generous man who was always blundering. If Peter's primacy is to be maintained, or that the scepter of the King Eternal was transferred to a body of men whom their teacher to the very last chid for their stupidity and want of faith. Contrast this with the real meaning of Jesus. Whoever accepts him as divine deliverer and lives sincerely in that faith shall be perpetually binding on himself certain things, or casting from himself certain things, but all his decisions he shall afterwards find were sanctioned by the Heavenly Father. Beyond and, someone first and the person who sets the rules, you can say both are completely metaphorical, but the power of the keys is given to every believer, and it is a power to be exercised over himself alone and not over another. Sincere faith in Jesus is the only safe guide through earth and heaven, and it is a perfectly safe guide. Now, why would God call prophets unless it was expected that they would be accepted. No forms nor ceremonies give entrance into this kingdom, nothing but the heart's unwavering belief that he is the anointed deliverer, the Son of the living God. One may enter the church, men's organization, by baptism and other rites, with oral or written professions of creeds, but one can enter the kingdom of the heavens only as he takes Jesus for his guide. And whether those outer forms are obliged or not, it's certainly the inner that actually becomes part. He may be in both the church and the kingdom, but being in one is no evidence whatever that he is in the other. Men shall come from the east and the west and sit down in the kingdom, while churchmen may be cast into outer darkness. It was an immense assertion whether he had any right to make it or not. Jesus certainly did put forward the claim to be the only medium of entrance into the freedom and enjoyment of the kingdom of the heavens. It seems to have satisfied Jesus that he has secured not simply a foothold in human affection, but a real root in humanity. He charged his disciples not to go out and announce him as the Messiah. It was sufficient that they believed in him. The multitudes were looking for a sensuous millennium and a secular Messiah to reign therein. Were they looking for a secular Messiah, or are they really just looking for a Messiah that had a role in this world? Because in the past, they all did, but again, it's the people. This idea, we got this leader. It's like, well, if the things don't go forward because he doesn't have an army or whatever to liberate his people, then, it was too late to revolutionize them. Was it? He had not succeeded. Well, succeeded in some sense, right? His disciples would not succeed. And if you say they didn't succeed, why didn't they succeed? Oh, then he wasn't really accepted. And then Christianity takes on, it's like, which is a different way of the whole thing. But the time for the perception of the beauty and grandeur of a spiritual messiahship had not arrived. It would come. He was content to await its coming, so that only the seed of the kingdom were meanwhile kept in the earth. In the history of Jesus appears what we do not detect in other men. He had a control over history. He allowed nothing to be antedated in fact, while he anticipated everything in thought. The shadow of the cross on his path lay as distinct as that which Gustav Thor, in his terrible pictures, throws everywhere on the way of the wandering Jew. He saw it. He talked of his death before it occurred with as much definiteness as he did that of John the Baptist after it had occurred. His disciples could not see the outline of the shadow on the path until Jesus pointed it out to them. Now he begins to tell them plainly, says the record in Mark 8, that he meant that he must go up to Jerusalem. He had absented himself from the late Passover. Now he must go to Jerusalem. He should suffer many things. The conspiracy formed against him by the elders and chiefs, priests, and scribes should culminate in his death. He should certainly be killed. And here's that lunar aspect here. But on the third day he should rise again. He plainly predicted that. Now, a lot of people were killed by the Romans and others, and it was only their own martyrdom that they achieved. Perhaps the impact of others. People say he was willing to die for his cause. The prediction of the resurrection seems to have made no impression upon them, whether it was because he talked so much in parables with them that their exegesis was often sorely puzzled, so that they knew not when to interpret his words literally and when figuratively. The reader may consult John 4:33, Matthew 16:7, and John 11:12 for passages in which Jesus manifestly spoke figuratively and which his disciples interpreted literally. At other times he spoke literally and they understood him figuratively. See Matthew 15, verse 15 and 17, John 11, verse 11 and 17, and John 6:70. Or whether the startling and astonishing announcement that he was to be killed came so suddenly after his joy at the recognition of his messiahship. The fact comes out afterwards that they totally forgot the prediction of the resurrection. The statement that he, the newly acknowledged Messiah, was to be killed was more than Peter could bear. He seized him by hand or dress, or perhaps in embrace, and exclaimed, God save thee. The phrase in Greek is an abbreviation and literally is propitious to thee or gracious to thee, meaning that the goodness of God should save the person from the evil spoken. A sudden ejaculatory prayer for the safety of the person addressed. The very form shows the great excitement of Peter. And although a lot of people don't know what that word means, certainly they would tend towards the other meaning than this meaning. So people don't say it that way anymore. God save thee, Lord, not to thee shall this be. See, so a different type of Lord than God. And the word probably here is Curie or something. So again, we know by this verse alone that when people said, Lord, Lord, they weren't saying that Jesus was a God or a part God or something, that he was new Baal, son of El. Baal, son of El, literally, that's the myth. That God had a son, and God, and this son either sacrificed or was the sacrifice, and there were other myths involved, but that was one of the ones on the table. Actually undertook to rebuke him, as Matthew and Mark agree in recording. Now there is some disagreements in the canonical Gospels, so we need to pay attention to some of that. Jesus turned his back on Peter, saying, Go behind me, Satan. Thou art my stumbling stone, for thou regardest not the things of God, but the things of men. A moment ago, the rock on which the church was to be built, if we accept this interpretation of churchism, then it is fair to hold churchism to what Jesus says now. And the same Peter is the very devil and a stumbling stone. But the words no more apply to Peter here than there in the sense of a closely restricted personal application. They contain a general truth. He who cannot accept the self-abnegation of Jesus and endure the humiliation of a violent and ignominious death, but is so carnal and secular as to desire a reign of visible temporal glory, is a stumbling block to the work of Jesus in the world. When they meet face to face, as Jesus and Peter did, it was a personal rebuke. Satan is the Hebrew name for the chief of evil spirits, in whose existence as a personality Jesus certainly believed. The general meaning of the word is tempter, or more correctly, adversary, one who sets himself in opposition to goodness and duty and right. It may have been used in this general sense to Peter, but certainly very pointedly and with a distinct recognition of the personal existence of Satan. Of course, in Christianity, Satan takes on a much more important role than in a lot of faiths, but even calling Satan the god of this world and age, which in monotheism would be God, right? This resistance of Peter to the announcement of Jesus of his coming death is proof that, notwithstanding his noble and lofty acknowledgement of the spiritual messiahship of Jesus, there still clung worldly notions to the mind of Peter and to the disciples and followers generally. He therefore called his disciples and the people near to himself and delivered a discourse to them, the substance of which is preserved by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and of which was as follows: If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Your persona for your persona, right? Or your projection of yourself, and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever may wish to save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's shall find it. See, again, it's deflecting away from the message, from him as a person to the message that he's coming with. Shall find it. And for what shall a man be profited if he should gain the whole world and lose his own life, or if he cast away, or be cast away. Or what shall a man give in exchange for his life? Whosoever shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven, and before the angels of God. But whosoever shall deny me and be ashamed of me and of my words before men, in this sinful and adulterous generation, him will I also deny before my Father which is in the heavens. For the Son of Man shall come in his own glory, and in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. Verily I say unto you, that there be some standing here which shall not taste of death, till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom with power. Which seems to mean this: his messiahship had been acknowledged, but was to be a bitter disappointment even to many who acknowledged it, because he was going to be killed. If any man thought of becoming his disciple, he must make up his mind to abandon all hopes of pecuniary advantage and personal ease and indulgence. He must go further. He must deny himself. What flesh and blood call for, he must often refuse even to himself. He must submit to ignominy and torture. Nothing was so graceful and painful as death by crucifixion, in which the condemned was compelled to carry the cross, which was to be the instrument of his torture, to the place of execution. So his disciples must learn to perfect submission to extreme sufferings. But there was a compensation even here. A man who gives his life up for the sake of Jesus and those doctrines of philanthropy, well, it's more than just relationship with human beings, but that was certainly an essential part of it, because you don't have religion. Spirituality can neglect the relationship with creation and the relationship with God, and it's just about, your own soul, what your own soul desires and whatnot. But, religion would have all three, right? Which he preached should indeed lose luxuries, comforts, home delights, and many a sensuous pleasure, but after all should find the truest and sweetest uses of life, whereas the selfish hoarder of his vital powers should find them shrinking within him. In general, vitality is maintained and strengthened by living largely, putting out the energies widely, life being not income but outgo. In this case, why should a man lose his life? If he kill himself in the effort to grasp the whole world, even if that effort should be imagined to prove successful, nothing would come of it. Well, it wouldn't be what he hoped for in some ways, but he would be gone, lost, a castaway, out of existence. Then where would there be any use of pleasures if he did not exist to enjoy them? The basis of everything is life. The universe is nothing without life. A man must therefore do all he can to increase his physical, intellectual, and spiritual vitality. The Luciferus thing, you get that for LVX, X being life, the spiritual vitality. The world will be so much world to him, and the man will be so much man to himself, in proportion as he has life, and life is got by giving. The more a man gives himself to his generation, the more he gets out of it. Jesus taught that to follow him was the way to gain life by giving it. So the love aspect. Men must therefore confess him by following him. That was going through a dark passage with the light, the L. He would not conceal that from them, but their hope of the messianic glory was not all a dream. It was a mistake insofar as it was secular, but it was a truth insofar as it recognized him as the conquering deliverer. Now there's this icon of the Zionist Messiah on a pile of bodies, and people are supposed to lick his boots or something like this. It's one of the ideas that they put at the end of some television shows and stuff. He was to come in glory, in his own glory, and God's, which he spoke of as being identical with a holy familiarity in such style as no man before his time or since has ever dared to employ. The rewards of mankind he represented as being in his hands, a prodigious claim. He knew the works of every man, and in exact accordance with those works he should give each man his reward, and there should be no mistake. Well, what if he just testified to that sort of thing? But he closed his address with a statement that there were those present who should not die until they saw the Son of Man coming in his kingdom with power. I do not know what he meant. Did his disciples, did any event ever occur in their lifetime which corresponds with this statement? If so, where is it recorded? I know what theories have been propounded in explanation, have read the commentators, am familiar with the views of theologians, and have perhaps a theory of my own, but the plain question to be answered honestly would amount to this: as each man in that company died, if he had been axed